Imagine for a moment stepping into the shoes of those who came before us. Welcome to a journey that transforms history into vibrant stories that captivate and inspire. You stand barefoot on powdery earth beneath a pale sky that shimmers with desert heat. Before you, a low, dusty ridge, and behind it, ancient stone stacked carefully, not chaotically rising in deliberate shapes. These are not just rocks. You are staring at the bones of a city older than written language, older than the pyramids, older than anything you've ever imagined. This is Jericho, or what's left of it. Now, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, post your location and local time. I love seeing where in the world we're all drifting off from. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wander the parched terrain around Tel Sultan, the dusty mound just northwest of modern-day Jericho, your sandals kicking up fine grit that's older than any country. At first, it looks like a barren hill, but look closely and you'll start to see order in the chaos walls shaped by hands, 10,000 years ago rising in uneven steps like forgotten thoughts. These aren't city walls like you imagine from movies, no high towers bristling with archers. These are low, thick stone walls built without metal tools, without wheels, without beasts of burden, just hands, lots of hands, and mud. You squint through the haze. It's 9600 BCE, give or take a century. The Ice Age is done with its final tantrums. A group of hunter-gatherers decides perhaps tentatively to stop moving. Maybe the nearby Ain es Sultan spring lured them in with its steady supply of sweet water. Maybe they just got tired of walking. Either way, something remarkable happens. They build a wall, not a small garden fence. A massive circular stone wall over 3.5 meters high and 1.8 meters thick, encircling a settlement. And inside that wall, mud brick houses round at first, then square. Storage pits, hearths, clay bins. If you squint, you can almost see the daily rhythms, bread baking, flint napping. Maybe a kid chasing a goat through the alleyways. Archaeologists call this settlement PPNAI, Pre-Pottery Neolithic A. Sounds sterile, but it was home. It was life. And no one really knows why the wall was built. Historians still argue whether it was protection from floods, wild animals, or other humans. There's even one theory, brace yourself, that it wasn't a defensive wall at all. It might have been ritualistic, symbolic, something to do with marking sacred space. Or perhaps, like many human creations, it served several purposes at once: safety, pride, and just a little bit of showing off. But here's the twist: people didn't stop there. Inside this ring of stone stood something even stranger. A solid stone tower over 8 meters tall, complete with an internal staircase. Yes, a Neolithic staircase. You're half asleep just thinking about it. Was it a lookout? A spiritual center? A really fancy granary no one knows. It's older than Stonehenge by 5,000 years. That's like comparing a cassette tape to a quantum hard drive. And the best part, it was all done without metal wheels or beasts of burden. Just people, stone, and time. There's something weirdly comforting in that. Like if they could build a city wall and a stone tower with only bone tools and sore backs, you can probably finish that email tomorrow. As you walk, the silence is broken only by your breath and the soft crunch of ancient gravel. The city beneath your feet isn't dead, it's layered. History here is like sediment in a coffee cup. Every civilization that followed just piled on top of the last. It's part city, part lasagna. And you begin to realize Jericho didn't happen all at once. It emerged like moss, slowly, quietly, and with surprising persistence. The first layers were humble, just mud brick dwellings and communal pits. But even back then, 10,000 years ago, something essential was forming the idea that people could live in one place, shape the world around them, and leave a mark that outlives them. You pass the wall again. Its stones are lichen-speckled patient. They've waited millennia for your visit. And tomorrow they'll still be here, probably watching someone else's sneakers shuffle past. Meanwhile, your eyes begin to blur at the edges. Dust swirls in golden shafts of twilight. A goat bleats softly in the distance, or maybe that's just your heating unit kicking in. There's no need to rush. Jericho certainly didn't. It waited nearly 10 millennia to be rediscovered, buried under its own ambition. And as you take a deep breath, feeling the air settle in your lungs, you realize this isn't just a wall. It's the memory of humans deciding to stay. Stay put. Stay safe. Stay human. You blink against the sun, or maybe your bedside lamp, and that ancient wall fades just slightly behind you. Now you're standing in its shadow, gazing up at something even more bewildering, the tower. Not just any tower, but what some believe to be the oldest monumental stone structure in the world. It looms over the Neolithic landscape with a kind of stony defiance. It's not graceful, it's not even symmetrical, but there it is, 8 meters tall, almost as wide, a hulking mass of stacked stone blocks, with an eerie stillness that hasn't budged in 10,000 years. You stare at the bottom where the staircase begins, worn by millennia. It curls upward into the dim interior like something from a dream you half remember. Who built this tower and why? Historians still argue whether it was a defensive watchtower, an astronomical observatory, or a ceremonial something or other, built to impress the neighbors. One popular theory, brace yourself for science fiction level coolness, is that the tower was aligned with the setting sun at the summer solstice. You picture Neolithic townsfolk watching the light pour in through the top of the tower like divine honey. Did they clap? Did they yawn? Who's to say? But here's a fringe theory that might just tuck you deeper under the covers. Some archaeologists suggest the tower was a giant communal alarm clock. No, really. Picture it. You live in a flat, low house surrounded by a bunch of other flat, low houses. There are no smartphones, no roosters, and definitely no Google Calendar reminders. But when the sun hits just right and floods that tower, it's like nature tapping you on the shoulder and whispering, "Time to start the day, my prehistoric friend." It's probably the most low-tech sunrise timer in history. As you sit at the base of the tower, you begin to notice the little things. The coolness of the shaded stone beneath you, the whiff of old dust and dry grass, the low, warm wind that snakes along the wall like an old friend. And then your mind drifts to the people who actually built this thing. They didn't have metal tools, no pulleys, no cranes. Just stone hammers, baskets, and frankly, an unreasonable level of optimism. Think about the logistics: quarrying stone, shaping it just enough, hauling it up, inclined, stacking it with prehistoric precision. All that, and the thing still stands. You might be proud of assembling that IKEA dresser, but these folks, they moved literal tons of stone without so much as a wheel. Sleep creeps in at the edges, and your imagination paints the scene. Maybe it's early dawn and you're watching from a crouch as builders wipe sweat from their brows with animal hides, balancing stones on crude scaffolding. Someone calls out, joking in a language we'll never decode. Another gestures to the sky. The work stops briefly, not for a coffee break, but perhaps to wonder what this tower even means. Is it a promise to the next generation? A stairway to the ancestors? A beacon for whoever might come next? Or maybe it was just the Neolithic version of a community center. A really inconveniently tall one. Whatever it was, it became something profound, a symbol of permanence, of presence. of rootedness in a world that had until very recently been entirely about moving on. This tower, in its awkward, stone-faced way, tells the story of people who decided to look up instead of always looking forward. And something about that is incredibly human. You lie there now half-conscious, imagining walking the spiral stairs inside. One careful footstep after another, the stones groaning faintly under your weight. The air grows thinner, darker, but not unpleasant. At the top, you peer through a gap, or maybe just a missing block, and take in the view low round homes, little figures moving like ants the spring, bubbling in the distance and beyond it. Emptiness, desert, silence, the world before cities. You suddenly remember something oddly comforting the tower they think was built in just a few weeks. A structure that's outlived entire civilizations. Just a seasonal side project. Apparently, the community may have rallied together pushing through the work in a burst of effort, possibly even as a kind of collective ritual. No supervisors, no budget, no PowerPoint, just teamwork. That detail alone might be enough to make you smile into your pillow. The tower casts a long shadow across your consciousness now. Its base buried deep, its top eroded by wind and memory, its builders long since returned to dust. But it's still there, standing taller than you'd expect from something so old, so handmade, so human. It's not a perfect tower, it wasn't meant to be. And yet it's become the heart of one of the oldest known cities on Earth. And as your breath slows, matching the rhythm of imagined desert winds, the final joke is this: it might not have been a tower at all. Some argue that what we now call the Tower of Jericho could have just been a really well-constructed grain silo. Imagine that. All that grandeur, all that speculation, just to keep the barley from getting soggy. But even if that's true, it's no less beautiful, no less meaningful. A tower is only a tower because we choose to look up. And you lucky sleeper get to fall asleep under it tonight. You're still lingering near the tower, its shadow stretching long across the dusty floor of the ancient settlement. But now your attention drifts towards something far more essential, something the tower couldn't exist without. Water, the kind you can hear before you see it. A quiet bubbling beneath cracked rock, a whisper at the edge of silence. You turn your head, and there it is, the spring of Ines Sultan. Gentle, unassuming, and astonishingly reliable, this natural freshwater source has been bubbling here for thousands upon thousands of years. And it's the reason any of this Walls Tower's home's ancestors was ever possible. Forget gold, forget armies. In Jericho, water was the real king. You're walking now, slowly following the sound as it grows clearer, the air just slightly cooler. The smell shifts to less dust, more green, more life. Around the spring, wild grasses once grew. Fig trees, date palms, papyrus, everything dry land isn't supposed to have. You reach the edge and there it is, the oasis. Even now it doesn't feel real. The harsh desert surrounds you, all orange cliffs and wind-polished stones, but here it's almost lush. You crouch by the water. It's cold against your fingers. Sweet, too, if you sip it. The people of ancient Jericho certainly did. And they stayed because of it. This was no mere trickle. It was a consistent, gushing freshwater source rare in the arid Levant. A kind of geological miracle. And the early settlers knew it. They camped here at first, then they lingered. Then they built homes, storage rooms, walls, and of course, towers. Because why wander when Eden already has plumbing? But it wasn't just about survival. Water enabled agriculture, which meant grain, which meant bread, which meant not chasing gazelles across the plains like sweaty nomads. It meant free time. It meant culture. So you lie back near the spring and imagine the scene: clay jars being filled, Kids splashing recklessly while their parents scold them in ancient dialects, elders sitting in the shade chewing something vaguely leafy. The city grew outward from this liquid heart. And here's the quirky twist: you wouldn't want to drink too much of it. Jericho's famous water has always had a salty personality, quite literally. It's slightly brackish, a bit mineral heavy, perfect for irrigating date palms and barley fields, but a touch aggressive if you're expecting Evian. Some scholars even think the salty composition of the water played a role in how Jericho's economy and agriculture evolved. You didn't get lush fields of cucumbers and cabbages here, you got dates, figs, and hardy grains that didn't mind the extra sodium. And that's where you begin to notice something bigger. Jericho was one of the first cities, but it was also one of the first experiments in ecological compromise. Here's a site with consistent water, but water that imposes limits. So people adapted. They changed their crops, their techniques, their schedules. They built irrigation channels, stone-lined pits, and perhaps most impressively, a shared understanding of how to manage the source. Because if the spring failed or if people fought over it, that was it. No more city, no more anything. Historians still argue whether these early residents had any kind of formal leadership or priestly waterkeepers. But what's clear is this: the spring didn't just feed crops, it shaped society. You roll to your side now, head pillowed by a prehistoric fig leaf mentally anyway, and imagine the slow rhythm of daily life. You wake with the sun, walk to the spring, fill your jar, nod to your neighbor. You irrigate your plot. You patch your mud bricks. You eat bread that tastes slightly of salt and smoke. And every evening you come back to the water to wash the day away. It's quiet, predictable, gentle, but don't get too dreamy. This was still the Neolithic. People weren't bathing in rosewater and baking cinnamon scones. The air was thick with bugs. You probably had some sort of mud-based rash, but compared to chasing deer across the scrubland's paradise, now for a fun fringe tidbit, there's a local legend likely invented much later that claims the waters of Anis Sultan are infused with fertility. Drink from it, the story goes, and you'll have many children. A lot of visitors to Jericho over the centuries have tested this theory. No scientific evidence yet, but hey, believe what helps you sleep. And here's another odd historical tidbit to carry into your dreams during the Bronze and Iron Ages. Long after the Neolithic city had fallen into ruins, the spring still kept flowing. In fact, some of the region's oldest religious rituals involved pouring water from this spring as a sacred act, a gesture of rebirth, renewal, hydrated holiness. You sip from your imaginary jar now. It's heavy, clumsy, sun-warmed. The water slides down your throat with a faint mineral bite. You sigh, your eyes droop, and yet beneath the earth the spring still murmurs. The same waters flowing under the feet of early Jericho now run beneath gas stations and tour buses. Same source. New world. It makes you wonder how many cities were born simply because a spring chose to be generous. How many grand civilizations began with one ordinary trickle, the tower glorious, the walls impressive. But none of it happens without water. You're still by the spring, the coolness lingering on your skin. But your gaze shifts now, not to the water, not to the walls, but to something altogether more intimate. Something eerie. Something that makes even archaeologists tilt their heads and whisper, "Wait, what?" Because under the homes and hearths of ancient Jericho, beneath neatly swept courtyards and clay bins of barley, lay skulls. Not random ones, decorated ones. Human skulls with shells for eyes and thick plaster sculpted lovingly over bone. Some even had paint. Pink cheeks, delicate hairlines. A hint of a smile frozen for 10,000 years. You're lying here in the dark, and yes, I'm telling you, the first city on Earth was also home to a skull cult. Sweet dreams. This isn't fiction. It's one of the most striking discoveries ever unearthed at Jericho. Inside early Neolithic homes, archaeologists found burials tucked beneath the floors, often of family members sometimes clustered together. But in several cases, the bodies had been deliberately decapitated and their skulls treated like sacred heirlooms. Imagine it after someone died, their body was buried, but sometime later their skull was carefully dug up. Then a layer of fine plaster was applied over the bone, reconstructing facial features with great care. Cowrie shells were inserted for eyes. Pigment added the finishing touch. These weren't crude trophies, they were works of art, memory made physical. And then these skulls were kept, displayed, revered, maybe whispered to on long evenings when the wind outside rattled the reed shutters. Historians still argue whether these were revered ancestors or something more ritualistic, maybe spirits meant to protect the home or links to a deeper spiritual past. Were they family members, community leaders? Did some households compete over who had the most expressive skull sculpt? No one can say for sure, but one thing is certain: they weren't trying to be creepy, at least not in the horror movie sense. To them, this was connection, continuity, a physical reminder that the dead were still part of daily life. You didn't lose someone, you just brought them a little closer. Right under the floorboards, right where the family gathered. You feel your own pillow shift beneath your head. A little reminder: thankfully, modern interior design has moved on. Still, there's something weirdly comforting in the idea. The earliest city dwellers saw death not as separation, but as a continued presence. The home didn't end at its walls, it stretched backward into memory. Now, here's an oddball theory that drifts through fringe anthropology circles like a ghost on a moped. Some researchers believe these skulls weren't just symbolic, they were used in ancestor consultations. You'd ask the decorated head a question, wait, and interpret a twitch of candlelight or a creak in the roof as an answer. It's part seance, part suburban family dinner. Another twist: the skull cult wasn't unique to Jericho. Similar practices show up across the Levant in places like Ain Ghazal, Nahal Himar, and Beisamoun. This suggests that the people of early Jericho were part of a broader Neolithic spiritual network, where the lines between life and death were blurrier than a dream at 2 a.m. Now, imagine lying down in one of those ancient homes. The walls are mud brick, soft-edged from the seasons. A fire crackles faintly. You lie on a woven mat. Overhead, the night sky pulses gently through a hole in the roof. And beneath you, great-great-great-uncle Thakil, staring upward through a mask of plaster and love. You'd sleep differently, wouldn't you? And maybe that was the point. Sleep, memory, legacy, all twined together in the layers of this city. The skull cult also tells us something crucial about the culture of early Jericho. They valued the past deeply. They weren't just building for themselves, they were building for their ancestors and perhaps their descendants too. Each home a family archive, each floorboard a layer in the story. Of course, not everyone agrees. Some archaeologists think the practice was far more practical. Plastering skulls kept the rest of the burial from being disturbed by scavengers or the elements. Some argue it's proto-religious art. Others say it's evidence of social hierarchy, a kind of VIP grave club. Whatever the truth, the image remains: rows of skulls lined up in silence. Eyes of shell, faces of plaster, names long forgotten. You close your eyes now and for a moment feel yourself among them, not as a ghost but as a sleeper in the world's first dreamer's city, where the living and the dead shared space, where memory had texture, and where art wasn't on the wall, it was the wall. And in a strange way, you're part of that too. Because the moment we started shaping our dead into stories, we also began shaping our future. Cities aren't just buildings. They're the echoes of every person who ever lived there tucked gently beneath the surface. And tonight you rest right above them. The skulls fade into the earth nestled back beneath ancient thresholds, and your thoughts drift upwards now to the homes that once stood above them. You're still in Jericho, still in that early Neolithic phase, but tonight your focus shifts to the very fabric of life here, mud bricks and gossip. You stir in your blanket, feeling a faint warmth that might just be sunlight streaming through a thatched roof, or your bedside lamp dimming in sync with your heartbeat. Either way, it's morning in ancient Jericho, and someone's already kneading clay with their bare feet. Because before anything else, the people of Jericho were brick makers. Thousands upon thousands of sun-dried mud bricks. That's what built this city. No fancy stone facades, no marble columns, just wet earth, straw, and time. Each brick was shaped by hand left to dry in the scorching sun, then stacked with care to form walls, ovens, storage rooms, and sleeping nooks. Entire homes rose out of river mud and determination. You wake slowly in one of those homes. It's round at first. Many of the early dwellings were circular with smooth, low walls and shallow dome roofs. Later, they become rectangular, more organized with sharp corners and designated spaces. But here in the first stages, there's something cozy about the curves. The floor is plastered a polished white that reflects the light. It's cool beneath your toes. You see a low bench, a fireplace smudged with soot, and jars lined up neatly against the wall. Outside, someone's calling to their neighbor in a language you'll never understand, but the tone pure morning routine. You imagine walking out squinting in the sun. A neighbor leans on a stick, their hair matted with sleep, and grumbles about how the goats got into the grain bin again. You nod sympathetically, having no idea what they said, but appreciating the timeless vibe of neighborhood drama. Yes, even in the oldest known city, people absolutely gossiped. There were no newspapers, no Twitter threads, no HOA meetings. But you can bet someone was always side-eyeing someone else's house renovation. Who patched their roof too early? Who baked with someone else's wheat? Who carved their ancestor's skull with too much flair? Even archaeologists have noticed signs of communal organization. Jericho wasn't a mess of huts. There were paths between houses, shared workspaces, centralized food storage. Some areas show signs of specialized tasks. Grain processing here, toolmaking there. A simple system, sure, but a system nonetheless. Historians still argue whether there was a leadership class, a proto-chief, a high priestess of mud, but there's little hard evidence. If there was any hierarchy, it was soft local and probably earned through trust rather than titles. Or maybe through bread. Bread seems like a strong political platform. Because let's talk about that bread. You can almost smell it, nutty dense, slightly smoky. It was likely flat made from emmer wheat or barley ground in stone mortars that still bear the grooves of ancient hands. The flour would have been coarse, the dough kneaded with patience, then slapped onto hot stones or inside small clay ovens. In fact, you're passing one now. A tiny domed oven tucked against a courtyard wall, its mouth still blackened with ash. Someone is fanning it with a woven paddle. A child sneaks a fingerful of dough when no one's looking. Life is in session. And here's a quirky fringe tidbit for your dreams. Some of these ancient homes may have had second stories. No, not elevator access penthouses, but low wooden lofts supported by reed mats or stone ledges. Perfect for sleeping, storing grain, or hiding from whoever you just insulted at the spring. This little vertical expansion hints at how even in the Neolithic space mattered. Privacy mattered. Separation of chores and sleep mattered. That's right. Even 10,000 years ago, people wanted a bit of upstairs, downstairs action. And what about furniture? Well, there probably wasn't much. Maybe a clay bench here, a basket there. Some evidence points to simple woven mats, animal hide pillows, wooden bowls. If you wanted ambiance, your options were limit to firelight, a few carved idols, and someone humming an untranslatable lullaby. Still, something about it feels complete. There's no clutter, no drawer full of expired batteries, just the essentials warmth food people. And mud, lots of it. Mud that had to be maintained. Because living in a mud brick house means constant repair. Rain mudslide, earthquake, mud crumble, goat collision, mud disaster. You'd spend part of each week re-smoothing your walls, patching gaps, repainting floors. It was a domestic loop that tied people directly to their homes. You didn't just live in it, you grew it. And with all that hands-on maintenance style inevitably crept in. Some homes show traces of decoration, red ochre patterns, painted niches, polished plaster. Not flashy, but thoughtful, personal. Maybe a spiral here, a geometric band there. Like a prehistoric version of a Pinterest board, but limited to earth tones. Now, here's a fringe theory to drift off with. One archaeologist proposed that the repetitive, meditative task of plastering and repainting floors might have served a spiritual purpose. Not just maintenance, but ritual, renewal. Each coat a layer of meaning, a prayer embedded in action. Makes you look at spring cleaning a little differently, doesn't it? You feel your breath slow as you return indoors, curl onto a mat, and let the soft hum of city life fade into the background. Somewhere nearby, someone grinds grain. Another seals a jar of dried figs. Someone laughs. Someone snores. The city breathes around you, and you realize as your limbs grow heavier, it's not the towers or walls that make this place a city. It's the routines, the bread baked at dawn, the bricks repaired before dusk, the whispered stories shared beneath reed ceilings, the faint creak of a second-story beam, the warm press of familiarity in every shared corner. 10,000 years ago, this was home, and tonight it's yours too. Outside your imagined mud brick home, the wind picks up. It rattles the edge of a reed fence, stirs dust along the narrow alleyways, and slips through the cracks of ancient plaster walls. But there's something heavier in the air now, something that isn't just weather. Because Jericho, for all its stability, was a city shaped by one constant, uncomfortable truth. It kept falling down. You shift slightly, imagining the crunch of gravel beneath your feet as you walk the perimeter of the ancient city again. The wall you saw earlier, the one built by hand, thick and solid, didn't last forever. None of them did. In fact, Jericho may hold the world record for the most repetitive rebuilding in one location. Archaeologists have uncovered over 20 distinct layers of occupation at Tel es Sultan, each with signs of partial destruction and repair. You picture the process: wall collapses, people sweep up the debris, rebuild right on top of the ruins, and continue with lunch like nothing happened. It's oddly comforting. Like if your house fell over, you just shrug patch it with mud and move on. But why did the city keep collapsing? Historians still argue whether the cause was earthquakes, floods, attacks, or just the unstoppable wear and tear of mud brick construction. Most agree the region is seismically active. Jericho sits not far from the Dead Sea Transform Fault, and let's face it, mud brick isn't exactly reinforced concrete. You imagine it now, a low rumble in the distance, pots, rattling dogs barking, someone yelling in a Neolithic dialect that probably translates to "not again." A crack snakes across your bedroom wall. Dust puffs down from the ceiling. A week later, someone's reshaping bricks, muttering under their breath, and life resumes. It's a rhythm that defines Jericho resilience through collapse. And there's a poetic charm in that. This wasn't a city that conquered through war or wealth. It didn't build monuments to kings or forge empires. It simply endured. Over and over again. Even the tower you visited earlier, it was buried forgotten, and then rediscovered by later inhabitants who probably said something along the lines of, that's weird, and then continued building over it. The city expanded and contracted over time like a living thing. Sometimes it thrived, its walls rising high, homes packed tightly, streets humming with daily bustle. And sometimes it shrank to a whisper, just a handful of families clinging to the spring, waiting for the ground to settle. Here's a fringe tidbit to dream on. Some archaeologists believe this cycle of collapse and renewal may have shaped early religion. Think about it: if your home keeps getting destroyed by invisible forces, earthquakes, floods, wouldn't you start looking for meaning? Maybe the earth is angry. Maybe the ancestors are restless. Maybe the plaster skulls under your floor need repainting. Over time, small ritual acts, plastering, burying offerings, chanting near walls, become early religious practices. Not grand temples, just survival rituals dressed in sacred language. You walk now along a freshly rebuilt street. Someone's repairing a collapsed doorway. Another is digging out a grain bin from under a fallen roof. Children toss pebbles into the dusty air, laughing. The city is still alive. And there's a lesson in that one that's soft and sleepy and worth clutching close as you drift off. Sometimes the only way to build something that lasts is to accept that it won't. You'll patch the wall. You'll rebuild the oven. You'll scoop the mud out of the sleeping corner one more time. Because cities and people don't survive by being unbreakable. They survive by being fixable. That might be why Jericho endured when other early settlements vanished. It didn't have the biggest walls, it didn't always have the best climate, but it had people who stayed, who rebuilt, who adapted. You settle deeper now, the dust swirling gently in your mind. The smell of wet earth clings to the air. Someone nearby is reshaping bricks with soft thuds. A fire crackles to life. The wind sighs through the city, but this time the walls hold. Here's a final curiosity for the night. Jericho's stratigraphy, that's the scientific word for its archaeological layer cake, is one of the thickest in the world, over 20 meters deep in some areas. Which means every step you take in that ancient mound walks you over thousands of years of human effort, failure, and persistence. A city made not just of buildings, but of attempts. Failed ones, rebuilt ones, some glorious, some laughably lopsided, all real, all human. So as your own walls shift around you, whether physical, emotional, or imagined, remember Jericho. It cracked, it crumbled, it stood again, and so will you. You've grown used to the crumbling walls, the dust in the air, the soft rhythm of life held together by mud and willpower. But Jericho isn't just a city of bricks, it's a city of names, shifting like sand through the millennia. Tonight, as you lie there drifting somewhere between consciousness and clay, you listen to the voices that have tried to name this place Jericho. Tel Sultan Ariha, and other syllables long since swallowed by time. Because the truth is, Jericho has always been here. But what people have called it, that depends entirely on who was standing here at the time. You roll onto your side and the breeze carries a whisper, Riho. That's how some early Semitic tongues may have pronounced it. Later, Greek sources recorded it as Jericho. The Romans kept it similar. Arabic speakers after centuries and caliphates settled on Ariha. But long before any of those before language as we know it, there was just a settlement by a spring. And no one wrote anything down. That's part of Jericho's mystery. Its earliest residents left no writing, no signs, no official name etched in stone. And so we've given it names from the outside, like guests naming a house they just walked into. You close your eyes and imagine someone asking you 10,000 years ago, "Where do you live?" You'd probably just point to the spring, maybe gesture to the tower. Words weren't the point. Survival was. Still, names matter. They reflect how people see a place and how they want it to be remembered. Jericho might derive from the Canaanite word rhea, meaning fragrance, a nod to the sweet air that still drifts from the surrounding gardens and date palms. Others suggest it comes from Yarayak Hebrew, for moon possibly referencing lunar deities worshipped here in the Bronze Age. Historians still argue whether the moon was a major cult object in ancient Jericho, or whether we're just grasping at symbolic straws in the dark. But imagine this: every time the full moon rose over the oasis, casting silver shadows across the mud brick walls, someone looked up and whispered thanks. Whether to the moon, to water, or to some ancestor with cowrie shell eyes, we'll never know. But it's not just spiritual names, it's political ones too. Because over the centuries, Jericho became a prize passed from empire to empire like a warm bowl of stew. Egyptian pharaohs may have called it by one name, Babylonian scribes another, Persian administrators something else entirely. Even today, it's a symbol of land identity, conflict, and hope. You walk now through the layered names like Vale's Jericho, Ariha, Jericho, City of Palms, the oldest city on earth. All true, and all just stories we tell ourselves to make sense of old stones. And here's a quirky detail: the modern city of Jericho. Yes, the one with buses, date vendors, and satellite dishes is technically not sitting directly on the ancient site. That mound Tel es Sultan is about a kilometer northwest of downtown. It rises like a quiet sibling, slightly separated, still sacred. Which means you could be buying oranges in a Jericho market today completely unaware you're standing in the shadow of a city that predates the wheel. That's the thing with names: they travel. They migrate. And Jericho's name has survived across every major language of the ancient Near East. Rare for a place. Rarer still for a place that collapsed so many times. Why does the name endure? Maybe because it was always more than a name. Maybe it was an idea. An idea that a city, no matter how small or how often rebuilt, could persist. That even if no one remembered who you were, the place could carry your echo. That a cluster of mud brick homes around a spring could evolve into something timeless. You curl up beneath that idea now. Let it blanket you. Because whether it was called Jericho, Ariha, or nothing at all, the feeling was the same. A place to stop moving, a place to grow old, a place to bury your dead beneath your feet and your name in the wind. It makes you wonder, do cities name themselves? Or do we name them in the image of what we need them to be? A refuge, a legend, a starting point. For many, Jericho was all three. So tonight, wherever you are, whatever you call your place, know that Jericho whispers beneath your own floorboards too. In every effort to rebuild, in every choice to stay, in every name passed down without writing, and in every breath that says, I was here. You stretch slightly, the imaginary reed mat rustling under your limbs. Jericho has already wrapped you in its ancient dust, its ghosts of walls and whispers of water. But now your mind begins to wander outward past the spring, past the bricks, past even the skulls. Because Jericho, for all its fame, was not alone. Tonight you're going to float gently through time and space to meet its neighbors. Other early settlements, other proto-cities, all rising from the earth in quiet defiance of the old ways. Because once people realized they could stop chasing antelope across the valley, settle down near a steady water source, and maybe even plant a few stubborn grains, everything started changing. And Jericho, though special, was just one of many early attempts. You begin with Çatalhöyük in what is now Turkey. A dense, buzzing hive of mud brick homes stacked almost like a modern apartment block with no streets and roof access entry only. Residents walked across flat rooftops and climbed down into their homes like descending into warm clay pockets. It was Neolithic urban planning, with a strict no front door policy. Çatalhöyük was a bit later than Jericho, maybe 1,000 years or so, But its complexity has long made historians wonder which city was truly first. Historians still argue whether Jericho or Çatalhöyük deserves the title oldest city. It depends on how you define city. Permanent homes Jericho, dense population Çatalhöyük, pizza delivery neither. And then there's Ain Ghazal over in modern Jordan, another large early settlement, with its own mysterious artifacts, enormous statues made of plaster and reed bundles. Big-eyed, staring, vaguely unnerving statues that feel like they should be whispering secrets in your ear. These places didn't spring up in isolation. The entire Levant and Anatolia region was alive with change. People were experimenting, innovating, comparing notes sometimes literally in the form of traded obsidian tools and identical clay figurines found miles apart. You roll onto your back arms, crossed under your head, and imagine the conversations between distant cousins in these ancient hamlets. So you've started keeping goats now. Yeah, and we lined the grain bin with clay this time. Keeps the weevils out. Nice. We just started worshipping a vaguely owl-shaped fertility statue. Classic, we're doing ancestor skulls over here. The quirkiness of early civilization wasn't just in how they lived, but how many different ways they tried to do it. And here's a detail that'll drift you closer to sleep. Jericho may have traded with its neighbors. Yes, traded. Imagine a string of obsidian from far-off volcanic hills in Anatolia turning up beneath a mud brick floor in Jericho, or a shell from the Red Sea found tucked beside a plastered skull. It's like one of those modern gift shops, but instead of magnets and keychains, they were trading sharp stones and symbolic tokens. Fringe theory time. Some researchers speculate there may have been seasonal migration between sites like ancient snowbirds hopping from one oasis to the next. Jericho might have swelled in winter, shrunk in summer. The earliest cities may have been more fluid than we think, more like shared homes than fixed capitals. You imagine a dusty path stretching across the Jordan Valley, a line of figures walking slowly beneath the sun, carrying baskets of grain, bundles of herbs, maybe a jar or two of fermented something or other. They greet the Jericho residents like cousins, catch up on the latest seasonal festival, grumble about the smell of goat droppings, compare spearhead designs, because people have always talked, shared, learned from each other. And that's what makes Jericho feel so alive, not just what was inside its walls, but how it connected with the world beyond. It was part of a growing web, a prehistoric social network of grain gossip and gradually improving roof construction. Even the architecture shows similarities across these early cities. Roundhouses in Jericho, roundhouses in Syria, rectangular ones later in both, plastered floors here, plastered floors there. It's like a slow-motion design trend echoing across centuries. Are we still doing circular houses? Oh, no, it's all right angles now. So much easier to stack jars. And through all of this, Jericho endures, its name rising up while others faded into unmarked mounds and forgotten syllables. Not because it was the biggest or the fanciest, but perhaps because it kept showing up, like your reliable friend who never throws wild parties but always brings soup when you're sick. The not-so-lonely city. And here's a final image to tuck under your blanket tonight. You stand on a small ridge above the valley. The sun is setting in slow amber strokes. In the distance, you can see little pockets of light fires glowing in clustered homes from Jericho to Beta to Nahal Hamar. A constellation of proto-cities all just beginning to grasp what it means to build a world. They don't know they're first. They don't know anyone will care. They just know it's home. And beneath your feet, the ground pulses gently with thousands of shared footsteps. The distant campfires fade, and now you're sinking softly into the heartbeat of the city itself, the slow pulsing rhythm of grain. Because if water was the reason people stayed, it was grain that let them thrive. And here in Jericho, you're about to discover just how world-changing a few stubborn grass seeds could be. You're in a courtyard now surrounded by low mud brick walls and the dry scent of cracked earth. In front of you, a woman crouches beside a large, flat stone. She picks up a heavy, rounded handstone and begins to grind. You hear it, that rhythmic rasping sound, soft and patient like the city's breathing. Grain was not glamorous, it was not flashy, but it was everything. Back in the pre-pottery Neolithic period, Jericho's residents began cultivating wild barley and emmer wheat, two species of cereal grasses that would go on to feed empires. But here they're just figuring it out. How to collect it, store it, process it, not die from the occasional mold. And let's be honest, this was backbreaking work. You picture it, long days under the sun, harvesting tough grass stalks with flint-bladed sickles, their handles polished smooth by tired hands. Then hours grinding grain between stones to make coarse flour. No toasters, no yeast packets, just smoke, fire, and hope. But oh, the results. That grain became flatbread porridge, maybe even primitive beer, depending on which archaeologist you ask and how optimistic they're feeling. You yawn. You can almost smell it, something nutty earthy with a hint of smoke. Ancient comfort food. Now here's a strange but oddly satisfying detail. Scientists examining stone tools from Jericho have found phytoliths, microscopic plant remains embedded in the grinding surfaces. That means we can tell exactly what types of grains were used even 10,000 years later. Imagine baking banana bread and someone 10,000 years from now knowing exactly what kind of flour you used. The grain bins found at Jericho, big clay-lined pits, sunk into the earth, show careful planning. Some had stone bases for durability, others were hidden beneath floorboards. Because once you have surplus grain, you suddenly need storage. And once you have storage, you need security. And once you need security, well, now you're building walls. Historians still argue whether agriculture caused the rise of cities, or if cities encouraged more intensive farming. Chicken meat egg, or in this case, grain meat oven. But either way, Jericho sits at that strange, tender crossroads between wild foraging and organized farming. A place where people likely still gathered wild plants, but also knew how to sow and reap season after season. That rhythm, the sowing, the growing, the grinding, the baking was life. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. There's evidence that early Jericho farmers domesticated plants that were terrible to eat. Yes, some early cereals had tough husks, small seeds, and low yields. But people kept planting them, tending them, loving them into being. Why? Because they were predictable, because they lasted, because you could build a life around them even if your bread was dense enough to injure someone in a food fight. So as you lie there, eyes drifting shut, you begin to hear it, the whisper of grain through dry wind, the scrape of stone on stone, the sound of baskets being filled. It's all very quiet, but in it you hear civilization growing one stalk at a time. You walk through the fields now, not golden but scruffy and patchy. You see neighbors comparing stalks, debating harvest times, inventing a new kind of sickle out of deer antler and flint. No one calls it agriculture, no one says progress, but they feel it. They feel something changing. And in a way, they're taming time itself. Because with grain, you're no longer at the mercy of chance. You can plan, you can preserve, you can stay. Cities begin when time slows down, and no plant slows time like grain. It demands patience, effort, memory. You must know when to sow, when to cut, how to store, how to bake. You need family to help, neighbors to trade with, and someone to help you lift that ridiculous grinding stone every morning. So even in sleep, even now, you are part of it. You are inside the rhythm, A world turning not on wheels, not on conquest, but on barley wheat and stubborn willpower. And here's one last soft thought before you drift off in those early layers of Jericho beneath collapsed walls and buried homes. Archaeologists have found grains of wheat still intact. Not fossilized, not petrified, just dry, ancient, waiting. Thousands of years later, we found them. And maybe somewhere in that dusty heartbeat, they're still waiting for someone to bake them into bread again. You lie still now, cocooned in the rhythms of early agriculture, the grain fields swaying in the back of your mind like soft seaweed in a prehistoric tide. But even as life began to organize itself around fields and families, Jericho faced a threat more unpredictable than wild goats or wall collapses. The climate began to change. You feel it first not as a disaster, but as a subtle shift. The breeze carries less moisture. The spring at Ina Sultan still burbles, but maybe it's just a little quieter. Maybe the nights grow longer, colder. The barley fields seem to yellow faster than before. Something is happening. Historians still argue whether Jericho was directly affected by the 8.2 kilo-year event, a sudden global cooling event that occurred around 6200 BCE. Caused by glacial meltwater disrupting ocean currents, it dropped global temperatures and sparked a widespread aridification across the Middle East. If you lived in Jericho, then you wouldn't know any of that. You just know your crops were failing. So tonight you're going to lie back and drift through the strange sensation of a city realizing it may have to fight the very land it was built upon. The spring didn't dry up entirely, but the region around it, more brittle now, less forgiving. Fields that once fed a family for months barely yielded enough for bread. And no bread meant no time to fix the house, no time to decorate skulls, no time to argue over which plaster pattern looked most sacred. Time began to tighten. You imagine the meetings, informal ones, no conference tables, just neighbors squatting in the dirt beside a stone jar half full of last year's barley. Do we plant again? Do we move? Do we eat the seed grain? It's the kind of decision that would keep anyone awake, even in a city famous for putting people to sleep with its rhythm. And here's a quirky, if slightly grim tidbit. Some archaeobotanical evidence shows sudden changes in the types of plants grown in ancient Jericho. Hardy, drought-resistant species become more common. Maybe someone experimented with new irrigation trenches. Maybe they offered prayers to the moon. Maybe they just hoped. In a way, the early residents of Jericho were the first climate adapters. They couldn't control the weather, but they could change how they lived. Storage pits got deeper. Grain was planted earlier. Homes became more insulated. Maybe goats were herded in greater numbers since they're more resilient than sheep. And in the silence of your own warm bed, you realize these were hard choices made by ordinary people. Because when we talk about ancient climate change, we often picture landscapes, not lives. But the people of Jericho, they were just like us. Tired, busy, worried about their kids and their roofs and their next meal. And then comes a darker chapter. There's archaeological evidence of abandonment. Not complete, not sudden, but slow, like sleep. Homes sealed. Storage bins left empty. No more plastered skulls under new floors. People moved away. Maybe not far, just over the next ridge to wetter pastures or easier soil. Or maybe they came back when conditions improved. But for a time, Jericho seems to lose its voice. The layers go quiet. Tools left behind. Ovens cold. The tower forgotten again beneath drifting dust. And yet, the spring still flowed. And eventually people returned. You can almost feel them stepping back into half-collapsed homes, brushing aside years of silence, lighting fires in old hearths and finding they still worked. Maybe a child picks up a flint tool buried in the courtyard and asks, "Whose was this?" And someone shrugs, smiles, and says, "Ours now." Because that's how cities survive climate change, not by defeating it, but by enduring. Jericho didn't become a ghost town. It paused, it adjusted, it let the land rest and then began again. Another quirky theory to rock you gently to sleep. Some researchers believe these early interruptions in city life are not signs of failure, but evidence of resilience. When the earth changed, people didn't double down. They moved, they watched, they waited. Then, when it felt right, they rebuilt. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson buried in these layers. Progress isn't linear. Civilization doesn't rise like a clean staircase. It stumbles like a toddler, tips over, and then tries again with a different pair of shoes. So tonight, in your own climate-controlled room, you rest beside them, not as an observer, but as a fellow traveler in the weather of human experience. The wind picks up slightly. Dust skims the surface of a cracked field. Someone plants anyway. A child laughs. And just like that, the city is reborn. The winds have calmed for now. The dry fields lie still, and Jericho is quiet again, but not abandoned. Tonight, as you drift deeper, we arrive at a question that historians and sleepy listeners alike still puzzle over. Why build a wall? Not just any wall. You've seen it by now, thick, deliberate, ancient. Made of stone, not metaphor. But was it really meant for war? You stir pulling the covers close and picture yourself standing beside it again. The Neolithic wall circling the early settlement like a stone embrace. Was it defense ceremony? Some prehistoric zoning regulation. Historians still argue whether Jericho's walls were primarily military fortifications or simply really fancy flood barriers. And depending on whom you ask or how sleepy you are, you'll get very different answers. One camp insists, yes, absolutely, this was to keep people out. Raiders, rival clans, that jealous tribe from the next hill who really wanted your date palms in your skull collection. Another side says, wait a minute, there's no solid evidence of warfare in Jericho at this early stage. No mass graves, no defensive weapon caches, no signs of battle trauma in the human remains. Could it be that these early people weren't fighting enemies, but rather the elements? You picture it now. A sudden storm, the spring floods, water rushing down from the hills. Without a barrier, it could destroy homes, soak grain, dissolve walls made of humble mud brick. So maybe the wall wasn't for war. Maybe it was a retaining structure, a way of defending against nature, not neighbors. And then there's the weird, whispery third theory that the wall was symbolic. A statement, a declaration that this tiny clump of homes was something new. A city, a place that belonged to the people within it, marked by stone and purpose. Like building a fence around your front yard to say, this is mine. This is us. You lean on the wall now. It's cool under your fingertips. Crumbling a little, sure, but still standing. It's not tall enough to stop a serious attacker, but it might stop a goat. And sometimes that's enough. You imagine the builders, no slaves, no beasts of burden, no pulleys, just neighbors working together, hauling rocks, laying courses of stone, stopping now and then to swat away flies or argue about alignment. And let's not forget walls take maintenance. Even in a peaceful time, they'd require effort to keep standing. That means coordination, scheduling, labor sharing. It means organization, maybe even early civic planning, which leads to this quirky tidbit. Some archaeologists believe the wall and the tower were built as part of a single organized public project. Not in bits and pieces, but all at once, possibly in under a month. That would have required a level of cooperation almost unheard of in that era. A Neolithic team-building exercise, no t-shirts, lots of calluses. And that matters because whether the wall was for defense or drainage or demonstration, it was also proof of something much bigger, collective will. You don't build a wall alone. You don't shape a tower for no reason. You do it because enough people agree, yes, this matters. And that agreement that shared a purpose is what cities are made of. So maybe that's the point. Maybe it doesn't matter if the wall was for war or water. Maybe what matters is that it marked a shift from a scattered group of gatherers to a society that said, let's build something together. You hear it now in the dream space of your mind, the voices of builders low and steady, stones scraping, someone laughing, someone humming as they lift the next rock into place. The work is hard, but the rhythm is good. And as they build the wall, does more than hold things out. It holds people in. Inside that circle of stone, a new kind of life takes shape. Predictable, organized, rooted. You wake in the same place each day. You know where the spring is, where the bread is baked, where the children will run in circles around the courtyard. Outside the wall, the world is wilder, less familiar, but inside it begins to feel like home. And here's a detail to tuck into your dreams. Later iterations of Jericho's walls became more elaborate, thicker, more layered. Some had stone foundations with mud brick tops. Others included guard rooms or gates. And eventually, war did come. But not yet. Not now. Now in this moment you lie within the first quiet embrace of a city. Not threatened, not invaded, just forming, holding space, cradling its people. So sleep, little wall sitter. The city is safe tonight. Tonight you lie still within Jericho's early walls, cocooned in soft earth and silence. But on the horizon, distant and hazy, something stirs. Something foreign, something dressed in linen. The Egyptians are coming. Sometimes. You don't leap up in alarm. After all, this isn't a proper invasion. It's more of a guest appearance, a footnote in a 1,000-year-long conversation. Because Jericho, for all its fame, often found itself floating in and out of larger empires' awareness, like a sleepy neighbor who forgets to RSVP, but still shows up with excellent dates and surprisingly useful obsidian tools. You stretch. The fire in your dream flickers low, and you imagine Jericho sometime during the early Bronze Age, quietly doing its thing, trading, growing, rebuilding, when along comes Egypt, curious and slightly better dressed. Historians still argue whether the Egyptian presence in Jericho was military economic or just occasional cultural flirtation. The archaeological evidence isn't overwhelming. You don't find massive obelisks or hieroglyphic graffiti that says Pharaoh was here, but you do find imported goods, little things, shards of Egyptian pottery, beads that clearly didn't come from local materials, a scarab or two with inscriptions that only a scribe could love. All subtle hints that Jericho, small and worn as it was still plugged into a larger, interregional network. Not a power center, but a node. A place where ideas and artifacts pass through. You roll over slowly and imagine the scene. An Egyptian trader walks into town squinting at the dryness. He's wearing linen because of course he is, and he's just traveled up through the Sinai with a small caravan of donkeys and ambition. The Jericho locals eye his perfumes and jars with cautious interest. He eyes their grain bins, figs, and obsidian knife sets. They probably don't understand each other well, but trade is its own kind of language. A few nods, a few grunts, maybe a shrug, and suddenly there's an exchange. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit for the night. Some scholars believe Jericho's location along a natural corridor, the Jordan Rift Valley, made it a perfect transit hub for ancient traders. Like a dusty rest stop between the civilizations of Egypt to the southwest and Mesopotamia to the northeast. Oh, not flashy, not rich, but dependable. Like a gas station with amazing coffee. That explains the variety of foreign objects found here over time. Canaanite, Egyptian, early Mesopotamian, Jericho welcomed them all. Briefly, quietly, then returned to its normal pace. Because the truth is, Jericho rarely took center stage in ancient geopolitics. It wasn't Jerusalem. It wasn't Memphis or Babylon. But it was there always a city-shaped whisper among louder voices. You hear it now, the hum of passing traders, the rustle of goods being unwrapped, someone muttering about the price of lapis lazuli, and then just like that, the caravan moves on. The Egyptian trader disappears into the shimmering distance. Jericho yawns, brushes itself off, and gets back to tending grain. Still, the influence lingers. Pottery styles change subtly. New dyes appear in clothing. Maybe someone adopts a different way of baking flatbread. Small shifts ripple through daily life, barely noticeable at first, but part of a larger cultural conversation. And here's a strange comfort in all this: Jericho didn't need to conquer or be conquered to participate in history. It just needed to exist, to keep its spring flowing, its fields planted, its people fed. That's its power, quiet continuity. Even during the times when it seems forgotten, there are long stretches in Jericho's archaeological record where things go silent. No major building projects, no signs of rulers. Just layers of normal life repairs, pottery fragments, seed husks. For some historians, that's disappointing. For you, lying there in the dark, it's kind of perfect. Because that's how most of history happens, not with fanfare, but with the sound of water ladled into a jar. A child's laugh echoing between plaster walls. A trader scratching a note in the dust with a stick before moving on. Another curious detail to drift off with: some researchers think Egyptian-style architecture might have influenced local building practices in Jericho. A particular kind of rectangular floor plan or the addition of small niches for votive objects. But nothing ever stuck entirely. Jericho never became Egypt. It took what worked and left the rest to the desert. Adaptation again. Absorption without erasure. And so, as you fade tonight, you float in that gentle space between influence and independence. You are both homegrown and cosmopolitan. You carry beads from foreign lands, but wear them in a way that's entirely your own. And that more than conquest or wealth is the heart of resilience. So, sleep easy, traveler of time. Jericho's night sky is clear, its stones warm, and its place in the world secure. Not because it shouted, but because it listened. You're deep in the layers, now tucked beneath time, nestled in the dust of centuries. Jericho has grown quiet again. No traders, no storms, no tower watchers. Just the low hum of history. And something glinting on the horizon. Bronze. A new age is coming, and with it a shimmer of transformation. You feel it before you see it, the subtle shift in tools and buildings and the people themselves. Copper meets tin somewhere far away, and the results echo all the way to this little city by the spring. Jericho, always stubborn, always patient, welcomes the Bronze Age in its own slow, earthy way. You rise now in the mind's eye, brushing loose sediment off your shoulders, and find yourself standing in a rebuilt city, walls straighter. Streets more defined. The homes are larger now, better organized. The round huts of the Neolithic are long gone. These are rectangular dwellings, sharp-cornered, more structured. Order is in. The tools are sharper, too. Axes, chisels, sickle blades not made of stone anymore, but cast in precious bronze. A metal that shines like the sun and cuts like it has an opinion. It's a big shift, but it doesn't happen overnight. Historians still argue whether Jericho's transition to the Bronze Age was gradual or abrupt, peaceful or traumatic. Some layers show signs of steady evolution, others sudden destruction. Ash-collapsed walls and the unmistakable scent of human panic baked into the ground. Yes, Jericho burned, more than once. You can still feel the warmth of those long-cooled fires in the layers archaeologists call destruction horizons. The walls charred, the floors blackened, pots shattered. Food stores scorched before they could be saved. So what happened? Some say earthquake Jericho is still sitting on its tectonic fault line, and Bronze Age walls even improved were no match for a good tremor. Others point to invasion. The region was growing crowded. More cities, more rivalries, more armies equipped with shiny new weapons and big ideas about expansion. Jericho may have been sacked, raided, or simply overwhelmed. Then again, this being ancient history, maybe both are true. Earthquakes make a city weak. Invaders arrive just in time to push it over. Either way, the city falls. But, and this should no longer surprise you, it rises again. Jericho rebuilds, always. That's just what it does. This time, the city comes back even bigger. The Middle Bronze Age settlement boasts impressive new fortifications, ramparts, and massive defensive walls built not with dry stack stones, but with mud bricks on stone foundations walls that may have reached up to 7 meters in height. You blink at that. 7 meters. That's over 20 feet. Jericho, once a loose cluster of huts around a spring, now looked like a proper city fortress. Not grand by Egyptian standards, but respectable. Secure. The outer wall archaeologists believe was built on an earthen embankment, creating a slope that would have made it nearly impossible for enemies to storm directly. Clever design, and exhausting to build. But again, Jericho's people rise to the occasion. You walk along the perimeter now. Hear the clink of bronze tools. Smell the sweat. See the organized labor teams working together in the heat, stacking brick-digging trenches. The air buzzes with ambition, and maybe fear, because this was an age of instability too. The cities of Canaan, Egypt, and Mesopotamia were engaged in long-distance diplomacy, but also in cycles of war, rebellion, and famine. One bad harvest in Babylon could echo across the Jordan. You settle near the gate now, a small one. Narrow, probably wooden and easy to defend. A child walks by with the basket of dates. Someone patches a hole in the plaster. Inside the walls, life carries on, always simple, always stubborn. And here's your quirky Bronze Age tidbit, buried beneath the layers of later destruction. Archaeologists found a cache of ceremonial items, including small female figurines, likely fertility symbols made of clay. They're worn smooth by touch, perhaps carried in pockets, perhaps left in shrines, perhaps kissed in desperation during drought. They tell us that faith didn't fade in the face of change, it adapted. As materials improved, as buildings rose higher, the heart of the city still pulsed with the same quiet hopes, food, safety, family reign. But even bronze can't hold back time forever. Toward the end of the Middle Bronze Age, Jericho begins to fray again. The walls once so proud start to fail. The city shrinks. Trade slows. Something isn't right. And then, gone. The Late Bronze Age leaves almost nothing. A thin layer, a whisper, maybe a few shards of pottery. No grand homes, no rich burials, no roaring fires or smashed gates. Just silence. Was it plague, famine, economic collapse? Historians still argue whether Jericho faded gently or violently. Some suspect it simply wasn't sustainable. Others think it was absorbed into regional powers, its population relocated or dispersed. Whatever the cause, by around 1400 BCE, the once proud walls of Jericho had fallen quiet again. And this time they wouldn't rise for a while. You rest now curled beside the embers of a city that outlived and outlasted, but also learned when to lie still. Because even the most enduring places know how to pause. So breathe deep, Bronze Age dreamer. The metal has cooled, the torch is dim, and tomorrow perhaps there will be stone and plaster again. But for now, the city sleeps. The Bronze Age smolders behind you, its fires dimmed, its walls crumbled into silence. And tonight, as you lie still within that long hush, Jericho slips into shadow, because now We reach the strangest moment in the city's history, not its birth, not its glory, not its rebirth, but its disappearance. You don't dream this part. You drift through it. Because for reasons still not fully understood, Jericho vanishes from the historical and archaeological record for centuries. Not a city sacked, not a city burned, a city absent. You roll gently in your blankets, imagining the ancient mound of Tel es Sultan, lying silent beneath the sun, its spring still bubbling softly, its air heavy with the scent of date palms and dust. But no ovens fire, no grain bins fill, no voices echo between the once busy walls. There's no dramatic collapse here, just a thinning. Historians still argue whether this gap in Jericho's occupation, especially during the late Bronze Age, was due to climate warfare political shifts, or something less concrete, a loss of relevance. Maybe it was no longer the crossroads it once was. Maybe trade routes shifted, maybe the spring just wasn't enough, or maybe the people simply left. One layer ends and the next doesn't start for a long time. It's unsettling in its quietness. We love loud history battles, crowns, trumpets. But this is like opening a book and finding missing chapters. Dust where there should be ink, and yet this silence it speaks to. Archaeologists find very little from this period. A few potsherds maybe, the outlines of a structure that might have existed, and then nothing. Some suggest Jericho became a seasonal stop, a campsite, a way station. Not a city anymore, but a resting place. You picture it. A lone traveler passing through. They know the name. Maybe they heard stories. They find the spring drink deeply, then move on. No one stays. And that's the haunting part for a city known for staying. Jericho suddenly didn't. But silence doesn't mean erasure, just pause. And while the city slept beneath its layers, a legend grew. You see, absence invites imagination. And during Jericho's long slumber, stories began to grow in the soil. Especially one story, a biblical one, that would later echo louder than anything the walls themselves ever said. But not yet, not tonight. Right now, we remain in the quiet. And here's your quirky tidbit for the night in this long period of abandonment. The spring of Ain Sultan never stopped flowing. Through droughts, earthquakes, invasions, and cultural shifts, it continued. Constant, patient, unbothered. Like the heartbeat of a sleeper who's dreaming something they can't quite remember. The land remembers even when the people are gone. You lie there, the ancient dust of Jericho swirling gently through your thoughts. A fox pads silently over the mound. A breeze rustles dry grass between collapsed stones. The moon reflects in still water. Somewhere nearby, a seed falls into a forgotten field and waits. And here's a fringe theory to drift off with. Some scholars believe Jericho's disappearance may have been deliberate. That perhaps when crisis came, the people dismantled what they could and took their lives and their stories elsewhere. That the fall of Jericho wasn't a tragedy, but a transformation. They didn't die, they adapted. And in a way, that's exactly what the city always did. So don't be afraid of the silence. Cities like people need time to rest, to reset, to shift, to wait for the world to circle back. Because eventually it always does. And when it does, Jericho will rise again. But for now, let it sleep. Let yourself sleep. Let the pause between breaths become its own kind of story. You stir slightly. Not because anything is loud, Jericho is still quiet, still sleeping beneath its dusty blanket, but because something is building in the distance. A vibration, a drumbeat, a horn maybe, or is it a trumpet? Because now, drifting gently forward in time, you find yourself approaching one of the most famous stories ever told, a tale of conquest, of divine noise, of walls that fall not to siegecraft or flame, but to sound. Tonight, Sleepwalker, you have front row seats to the Battle of Jericho, or at least the idea of it. Historians still argue whether the biblical account of Jericho's fall, found in the book of Joshua, is historical symbolic or something in between. But the image is unforgettable. A city with mighty walls, a wandering people freshly freed from Egyptian bondage, a priest-led procession, trumpets blown, and on the seventh day, with a great shout, the walls collapse. You lie there imagining it. Stone walls cracking not from battering rams, but from vibrations. The air charged, dust swirling, time holding its breath. It's cinematic, almost too cinematic. And that's what makes it so sticky. You picture yourself among the crowd barefoot on cracked earth eyes, wide the air pulsing with the sound of ram's horns. You're not sure whether it's faith, fear, or physics that will bring those walls down. But they do. In the story, they fall. Completely. But did they? Here's where the real mystery starts. Archaeologists excavating Jericho in the 20th century, especially the famous Kathleen Kenyon, found something curious. They uncovered a collapsed wall layer that could match the biblical timeline, but it was already in ruins before Joshua would have arrived according to conventional chronology. So did Joshua conquer an already fallen city? Or did the story grow from the ruins? Kenyon's findings, backed by radiocarbon dating, pushed the destruction of Jericho's city walls to around 1550 BCE, a few centuries before the traditional date of Joshua's conquest, 1200 BCE. This threw a giant dusty wrench into the idea of a trumpet-assisted collapse, and yet the story endures. Because stories aren't always about perfect timelines. Sometimes they're about meaning. And the story of Jericho's fall is one of power meeting, silence of faith, versus fear of walls giving way when reason says they shouldn't. Here's your fringe tidbit for tonight. Some scholars, not mainstream but spirited, suggest that the vibration theory might not be entirely symbolic. Could the sound of coordinated trumpets coupled with foot stomping and an already unstable structure have helped tip ancient walls? Possibly, but you'd need a pretty specific frequency and a very cooperative choir. Still, it's a fun thought. That maybe something about the ritual itself, the circling the horns, the collective breath did change the world. But even if the archaeology doesn't match the exact account, the impact of the story is undeniable. It gave Jericho a second kind of life, a mythological one. You feel it now sinking in the way the city was repurposed by narrative. Not just as a real place, but as a symbol of obstacles overcome, of divine favor, of sudden reversals. And here's another gentle curiosity in later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions. Jericho becomes a kind of threshold. The first city conquered in the Promised Land, a place where the journey begins anew. Even Jesus visits Jericho much later in the New Testament. A blind man is healed. A tax collector climbs a sycamore. The city, always small, always dusty, becomes a backdrop for redemption stories. It's like history just can't stop coming back. And neither can you. You lie there now, not among ruins, but among echoes. The trumpet fades, the dust settles, the wall real or imagined is down. And here's your final whisper for the night. Whether or not the walls fell to sound, the story itself has endured longer than any stone ever could. Because sometimes it's the telling that keeps a city alive. So sleep easy. The battle is over. The horns are quiet. The city is still here beneath your feet, in your thoughts, and in every story about overcoming something that seemed unshakable. And in the morning when you wake, the walls might still be standing. But you'll see them differently. The trumpets have faded. The dust has settled. And once again, Jericho lies still beneath your thoughts, half ruin, half relic, and entirely mysterious. But now you move from myth back into the tactile world of dirt and trowels, of brushes, boots, and arguments under the desert sun. Because the next chapter in Jericho's long layered tale belongs not to kings or priests, but to people with hats, notebooks, and questionable field lunches. Yes, tonight you fall asleep beside the hum of the 19th and 20th centuries, when archaeologists finally arrived and began to dig in. You shift gently the imagined breeze replaced by the quiet rustle of pages and survey maps. The year is 1868, and Charles Warren, an officer with the British Royal Engineers, visits Jericho. He's interested in biblical geography and figuring out where exactly those walls might have stood. But his methods, let's say, energetic. He digs a trench not carefully, just straight through the ancient mound, like a man slicing a cake with a chainsaw. Still, the interest he stirs is contagious. Soon others follow Germans, Americans, and eventually the British archaeologist whose name becomes inseparable from Jericho Kathleen Kenyon. Now it's the 1950s. You're drifting off to the sound of dry wind, the scratch of pencils on field reports, and the slow, deliberate scrape of trowel against soil. Kenyon was no treasure hunter. She brought method, patience, a firm belief that stratigraphy, the layers of soil properly understood, was the key to real understanding. And what she found was complicated. She dug deep, down to the Neolithic roots, through Bronze Age layers, Iron Age remnants, all the way to the foundation of the famous tower. She confirmed what earlier archaeologists had suspected: Jericho is old. Very old. But she also found something that rattled more than a few assumptions. Those city walls that were supposed to match the biblical account, they didn't. Not in the right layer, not from the right time. Historians still argue whether Kenyon's interpretation was correct. Some say she missed later evidence. Others say she exposed the limits of 19th century biblical literalism. But either way, her findings reframed Jericho not as a place of holy legend, but as a case study in human persistence. Kenyon didn't chase stories. She uncovered lives mudbrick by mudbrick, seed by seed, bead by bead. And here's your quirky, dream-soaked tidbit for the night. Kenyon's team, working in brutal Jordan Valley heat, sometimes sifted soil in their tea strainers. Not because they were eccentric, though maybe a little, but because even the smallest flint chip, the tiniest bone fragment, could change everything. That's the kind of care Jericho demands. And what did they find, these modern diggers? Not treasure. Not tablets of law or golden idols, but things more humble and more profound. A tiny carved animal figurine smoothed by years of touch. A collection of plastered skulls lovingly kept in niches beneath long decayed homes. Traces of wheat, barley, lentils, and chickpeas. Burn layers that told of fire, then silence. Footprints almost in hardened clay. These weren't the grand artifacts of empire. These were the fingerprints of real people doing real things. You breathe slowly now. The trench is deep. The sun has set. Kenyon's canvas tent flaps gently in the evening breeze. Somewhere nearby, someone is labeling a box of potsherds from layer 7, and the mounded listens. Patient, quiet. It has been through worse than excavation. You might even say it likes the attention. But archaeology isn't just digging. It's narrative control. Each generation sees Jericho through its own lens. For the Victorians, it was proof of the Bible. For Kenyon, it was a riddle wrapped in mud brick. For today's archaeologists, it's a data set, a site to be digitally scanned, 3D modeled, and satellite imaged. And yet the deeper we go, the more mystery remains. Even now, some scholars suggest that parts of the site may never be fully excavated, not because we can't, but because we shouldn't. That the mound itself is a kind of sacred text, one not to be read too quickly, one meant to endure unanswered. So tonight, as you roll gently into the comfort of old earth and the older questions, know this: Jericho is still being written, in the lines of reports, in the cracks of ancient stones, in the minds of those who kneel in the dirt and whisper, "What happened here?" You might not get an answer, but you'll dream better for having asked. The dust of excavation still clings to your thoughts as you float forward in time, past the canvas tents and gentle scraping of trowels. The voices of Kathleen Kenyon and her team fade into silence, and now a different kind of hum begins, cool, sterile, methodical. Tonight, you drift into the 1950s, the era of optimism, paranoia, and radiocarbon dating. Because Jericho, that quiet mound beneath a dry sky, was about to become ground zero for one of the great archaeological plot twists of the 20th century. You lie still, almost afraid to breathe, as the tools of archaeology suddenly shift from hand-brushed pottery to nuclear science. In 1949, a breakthrough changed everything. Willard Libby and his team developed radiocarbon dating, a technique that allowed scientists to determine the age of organic materials by measuring the decay of carbon-14 isotopes. Sounds dry, feels like magic. Historians still argue whether radiocarbon dating always tells the truth, but in the 1950s it felt like a time machine with lab coats. And Jericho, it was one of the first major test sites. Kenyon's team, meticulous as ever, sent charcoal samples, tiny flecks of ancient wood-burnt seed-old plaster, to laboratories in Britain. Their goal: to double-check the dates for Jericho's Neolithic and Bronze Age layers. What came back? Shock, confusion, revision. Some of the Bronze Age destruction layers, previously thought to match biblical events, were suddenly hundreds of years older than expected. The collapse of the city wall, thought to be around 1200 BCE, was radiocarbon dated to around 1550 BCE, well before Joshua's time. Cue the uproar. Scholars recheck their notes. Biblical archaeologists scratch their heads and sometimes their reputations. Debates exploded across journals and lecture halls. One side said, "See, science disproves the story." Another said, "Wait, maybe we dated the wrong layer." Another still said, "Let's not panic. It's just one city." And you just roll over in bed, cozy in the knowledge that ancient cities are more stubborn than any theory. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. One of the radiocarbon samples from Jericho came from a layer of burned grain thousands of years old, buried in the collapse of a building and roasted just enough to be datable. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't gold, it was lunch. And it changed the timeline of biblical archaeology. But not everyone agreed. In fact, one prominent American archaeologist, Bryant Wood, spent decades arguing that Kenyon had misinterpreted the evidence, that the destruction could line up with the biblical account after all. This wasn't just academic bickering. It became deeply political, tied to questions of faith history and the role of science in sacred narratives. Jericho was no longer just a city. It was a battlefield of interpretation. But while experts clashed in books and conferences, the city itself remained remarkably silent. It didn't care who thought its walls had fallen when. It just kept doing what it had always done, exist in layers, waiting. And here's the irony to rock you gently. All that cutting-edge science, all that isotope analysis and statistical calibration, it only served to confirm what Jericho had already been whispering for millennia. I am older than you think, older than kings, older than iron, older than most dreams. You let that settle now. The idea that thanks to a few burned seeds and a radioactive isotope, we know that people were building cities before they had metal, before wheels, before writing, before history knew how to write itself down. And yes, radiocarbon dating has limits. It has margins of error. It has calibration curves and noisy data. But it gave us something close to certainty: that Jericho's Neolithic settlement stretched back to at least 9600 BCE, that its stone tower was already standing when the Sahara was still green, that its mud brick homes held warmth while mammoth still roamed farther north. So while some lament that radiocarbon dating complicated biblical narratives, others celebrate what it gave instead: proof of incredible age endurance and quiet sophistication. Not myth, not miracle, just real people in real time building something that lasted. And as you curl into your blanket now, you don't need certainty to sleep. You just need that one truth that even in the 1950s, under the white glare of laboratory lamps and Cold War headlines, someone paused to carbon date a sliver of burnt Jericho wheat. And what they found was astonishing, not because it confirmed a story, but because it whispered, "We were here long before you guessed." The machines fall quiet now. The lab lights dim and Jericho exhales again, no longer. Just a sight of spades and dates and isotope readings, but a city back in the hands of people who interpret shadows. Tonight you drift deeper into the 20th century, but this time through a lens not made of glass or bone or bronze, but of politics. Because somehow in the Cold War haze of the 1950s and beyond, ancient Jericho became a kind of pawn. A place where archaeological trenches met geopolitical tension and where the past could suddenly be a very dangerous kind of present. You lie still and the air shifts. A different kind of heat. Not from desert sun, but from debate. From pressure. From ideologies watching each other through the dust. Because by the mid-20th century, the West Bank where Tel es Sultan lies had become a political chessboard. Following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Jericho came under Jordanian control, and later following the 1967 Six-Day War, it was occupied by Israel. These changes didn't just shift borders, they shifted stories. Suddenly, the ancient stones of Jericho weren't just academic curiosities, they were claims, proof, evidence, anchors. Everyone wanted Jericho to say something, to mean something. Historians still argue whether archaeological research during this era was subtly or not so subtly influenced by political agendas. Excavations were funded and promoted not just for knowledge, but for national narratives. Jericho was no longer just the oldest city. It became for many the first foothold in a promised land. You hear it whispered now softly at first. If the walls fell here as described, then perhaps the rest of the story holds too. That's a heavy thing to lay on a pile of collapsed bricks. But that's the Cold War for you. Everyone wanted to define the past in a way that supported the present. The United States, the Soviet Union, European powers, and various Middle Eastern governments all paid attention to archaeology not just for its scientific merit, but for its symbolic weight. Here's a fringe tidbit to lull you deeper. There are actual declassified CIA memos from the 1960s and 70s discussing regional digs not because they were interested in carbon dating, but because control of cultural heritage sites was seen as strategic leverage. Think about that. You're trying to uncover a Neolithic storage pit, and someone 5,000 miles away in a suit wants to know if your grant came from the wrong government. Archaeologists in Jericho during this time walked a fine line. They were digging in layers of prehistory while dodging the minefields of modern politics. Publishing one interpretation could make or break a career or ignite a diplomatic spat. Even Kathleen Kenyon's famously neutral methods were occasionally accused of undermining religious claims. Others working in more biblically traditional camps were accused of cherry-picking data to fit the Bible. No one could quite agree where history stopped and politics began. And yet in the middle of all this noise the city endured. Archaeologists still cataloged every bone fragment. Volunteers still sifted soil by hand. The spring still flowed unaware of the checkpoints and headlines. Meanwhile, Jericho became a site of tourism too. Tour buses arrived. Guides pointed at stones and offered simplified stories. This is where the walls fell. This is the oldest city in the world. People bought postcards, drank orange juice, posed beside signs. And just like that, the city slipped once again into a symbol softly edited for each audience. But in the silence of night, when no cameras flash and no diplomats circle, Jericho simply exists. Neither myth nor weapon. Just a mound. A memory. A place that has seen more seasons than any border ever drawn. And that's the quiet power it holds. You lie here now within that layered silence, and imagine the ground beneath you, not as disputed territory, but as shared inheritance. Every grain of earth, every crumbled step touched by people whose names we've forgotten, but whose stories we still whisper. Not to prove anything, just to remember. So tonight you rest in a city that has been politicized, misinterpreted, cherished, and claimed, but never erased. Because no matter who draws the map, Jericho remains. The borders fade, the politics go quiet. And now Jericho hums again, not in confusion, but in continuity. Tonight you return not to ruins or rituals, but to something more remarkable resilience. Because after all the upheavals, after the excavations, the arguments, and the headlines, Jericho did what it always does. It rebuilt. You're no longer dreaming in ancient time. You're now drifting gently through the last few thousand years, not the flashy ones, but the quiet centuries where Jericho kept going stone by stone, breath by breath. You rise into a familiar sun. The spring still flows. The birds still stir in the palms. And people, they never really left. Yes, the ancient mound of Tel es Sultan, may have gone quiet after the late Bronze Age, but the surrounding region, the name, the settlement, they endured. Historians still argue whether Jericho counts as continuously inhabited, depending on whether you count gaps in occupation of the Tel itself. But the wider area around it remained a place of life of orchards, date palms, and homes clustered near water. By the Iron Age, new people settled nearby. Different languages, different gods, but same spring, same wind, same gentle heat. You imagine them now, just like the early settlers, they draw water in jars, they eat flatbread, they argue over goats, and yes, probably complain about taxes. The city shifts adapts. Under the Babylonians, Jericho appears again in records a small administrative center. Under the Persians, it's known for producing date honey of all things. Sweet, sticky, and likely served on coarse bread beside a fire. Later still, in the time of Alexander the Great, Jericho becomes a prize again. Not for its size, but for its gardens. The area was famed for its balsam groves used in perfumes and medicine, so valuable that even Roman emperors took interest. You roll slightly, breathing in imagined fragrances, resin dust, ripe figs, smoke. The scent of an old city that never quite left. And under the Romans, Jericho shines for a moment, brief but real. King Herod builds a winter palace nearby with aqueducts and bathhouses. The ruins of it still stand today, just a short walk from the ancient Tell. You can almost hear sandals scraping over stone servants hauling water, someone muttering about politics in low Latin. Even Jesus passes through. In the Gospels, Jericho is where blind Bartimaeus finds his sight, where Zacchaeus climbs a sycamore tree, where redemption is spoken softly under the shade of leaves older than the empire. And long after the Romans fade, Byzantines, Umayyads, Crusaders, Ottomans, each leaves a footprint, a coin, a wall, a column. Each time Jericho is small, modest, sometimes no more than a village, but always there. And here's your quirky tidbit in the early Islamic period. Jericho had a small mosque made from recycled Roman materials. Talk about sustainable architecture. Stones that once held up a palace now echo with prayers. By the time the British arrive in the 20th century, Jericho is a sleepy market town known more for citrus than for stone towers. But it has charm, color, and a memory that refuses to fade. Today, modern Jericho Ariha in Arabic sits just a kilometer from the ancient Tell. A city of around 20,000 people. Tour guides, farmers, school children, Wi-Fi. And yes, people still visit the mound, still climb it, still wonder. The archaeologists come and go. The scaffolding rises and collapses. New excavation seasons open. Old debates continue. But for the residents, life goes on. Bread is baked, seeds are planted, coffee is poured. And somewhere, a child kicks a ball near a wall that once held up the sky. Jericho is no longer trying to be first or oldest or most important. It doesn't need to. because it has become something rarer, constant, and you sleepy traveler are now a part of that. You lie here in a city that has been torn down and rebuilt more times than history bothered to count. A place that has no business existing anymore, but does. Not because of walls, not because of myths, but because people kept returning. Again and again. So tonight you rest among them not as a historian, not as a pilgrim, but as one more soul passing through a place that never quite left. A city rebuilt again and again, and still breathing. The night deepens now quiet and warm, and Jericho lies beneath you like a cradle of dust and memory. You've seen its walls rise and fall, heard its name whispered in stories and shouted in arguments. But now comes the question that every sleepy historian eventually faces. Is Jericho really the first city on Earth? It sounds definitive, doesn't it? The first city? As if history keeps a scoreboard. As if there's a trophy made of sun-dried brick waiting in some invisible museum. But history is never that neat. You turn gently nestled among dreams and find yourself asking what makes a city anyway? Is it walls? Jericho had those? Is it permanent housing? Check. Is it grain storage, labor division, ancestor veneration, collective construction projects, water management, maybe a smidge of ceremony? Jericho ticks a lot of boxes, but so do other sites scattered across the Fertile Crescent, like breadcrumbs from the earliest bakers. There's Sadelhoyuk in Anatolia, densely packed no streets, rooftop entries, weird murals. Slightly younger but larger. There's Ain Ghazal in Jordan with its eerie statues and clear social complexity. There's Tel Abu Huraira with layers reaching back even before the Neolithic, where people slowly shifted from foraging to farming. Historians still argue whether city even applies to these early sites. Some prefer terms like proto-urban or large sedentary village. Others say the label doesn't matter, it's the function that counts. And here's your sleepy, paradoxical fringe tidbit. The more we learn about early cities, the less confident we are in calling any one of them first. Because life didn't start in a straight line. It bloomed like wildflowers after a desert rain, simultaneously unpredictably beautifully. And yet Jericho remains the oldest continuously investigated city. Its layers go back the farthest. Its stories have survived the most retellings. It has been redefined more times than most countries, and through it all, it never let go. Even when other contenders rise, Jericho shrugs, sips its spring water, and lets the dates ripen. It doesn't need to be the first to be foundational. You lie there trying to define a city by candlelight in your mind. Maybe a city is a place where people build instead of move, where the dead are remembered, where grain is guarded, where the future feels possible, and where the past is so thick underfoot it slows your step. By that measure, Jericho might not be first, but it might be the first to feel like home. And there's something lovely in that, because first is overrated, oldest fades fast, but home is eternal. And here's a final thought before we descend into the softest part of the night. Jericho may not be the biggest or the richest or the most intact, but it is where humanity started to think about staying. Not just surviving, belonging. So no, maybe it's not the first city, but maybe it's the first place where people looked around and said, let's stay, let's remember, let's make this ours. And that may be the beginning of everything. You've wandered the city's oldest paths, stood beside its broken towers, and floated over its silent gaps. Now Jericho lies fully beneath you, not just as history, but as memory. Because here at the end of our journey, there's no twist, no revelation, no final monument to point at and say, this is what it meant. There is only the echoes beneath your feet. You lie still, the imagined ground pressing gently against your spine, as if the tell itself has curved upward to cradle your thoughts. Above the stars, those same stars that watch Neolithic builders, Bronze Age traders, Roman priests, and British archaeologists all try to make sense of this place. Now watch you too. And Jericho, it breathes, not loudly, not in fanfare, but in the way spring water keeps flowing even when no one is looking, in the way walls fall and rise and fall again, in the way time itself seems to soften when you step into this valley. Because this isn't just a city made of bricks and sediment. It's a city made of decisions. The decision to stop moving. The decision to bury the dead beneath the floor. The decision to build a tower not because you need to, but because you can. The decision to rebuild again and again after everything falls. Historians still argue whether Jericho was first, whether its walls really fell to trumpets, whether that skull cult was art worship or something in between. But none of that changes what Jericho tells you as you drift into sleep. That time is layered, that people leave traces in everything they touch, and that the past is never as distant as we think. You listen now, and in the stillness you hear the grinding of grain on stone, the splash of water in a clay jar, the laughter of a child chasing a goat into a storage pit, the murmur of an old woman whispering to a plastered skull, the groan of a wall settling one last time. And you hear yourself too, because every city holds echoes of its people, and now in your own soft way you've walked there. You've added your breath to Jericho's long wind. You've felt its rhythm. You've stayed even for a moment. And in doing so, you become part of it. Just as those early builders never dreamed that their walls would still speak 10,000 years later, you may never know how long your own echoes will carry. But they will, because the first cities aren't just ruins, they're reminders. Reminders that we endure not through power or precision, but through presence. And now we enter that presence one last time. So let yourself go now. There are no more walls to examine, no towers to climb. The spring still flows somewhere nearby, just out of sight, murmuring like the last line of an old story. You've traveled through thousands of years, not rushed, not confused, but gently carried. And now the edges of the world soften. Your thoughts begin to blur like ancient paintings left in the sun too long. Shapes drift apart, then come together again as dreams. Mud bricks fade to dust, then rebuild themselves in golden twilight. Somewhere, a trader hums a tune you don't recognize. A bird stirs in the reeds. A single fig drops from a tree. Everything slows. There is no timeline now. No argument to settle, no carbon test to perform. There is only breath, yours, the earth's, the stories. This moment is the true foundation of any city, the quiet after all the building is done. The peace after the last fire is banked. The sigh after the last stone is placed. And as the silence rises, you feel it. Jericho is still here. You are still here. And sleep has come to meet you both. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.